I would like to pass it over to our presenter today, Dean Spade. Thank you so much.
Hi, it's so amazing to be here and see all the places you all are coming from. Singapore, Switzerland, here in Washington State where I am, people from all over Canada. It's so cool all over so many places. Really excited to be in this conversation. So grateful to Shareable for this series, for making it free, for inviting me to be part of it. Grateful to the interpreters and everyone who's making this happen. Okay, I'm just going to dive right in. I've got a bunch of content I want to share, and the session will be interactive. There'll be times when I invite you to share things in the chat. I'm not going to read the chat the whole time I present because there's too much going on, but at times I will read parts of the chat out loud once I've given people a prompt. Sometimes I'll be reading what I see there. I'll be reading what's on my slides. So if you would rather just listen to this session and not look, that's great. And the slides are available to everyone, so you can look at it later. There's nothing on there that I'm not ready to have you have. So if you want to just listen at any point, you'll be hearing a lot of what's going on. I think it's so great that this is being recorded and people can watch later. Some concepts I'm hoping to get through during our time together. What is mutual aid? What are some common problems for groups doing mutual aid work and what helps? Principles for mutual aid work. Avoiding charity tendencies. We'll talk about the differences between charity and mutual aid. Creating group culture intentionally. Dealing with procrastination and perfectionism. And finding joy in working together for liberation. So I'm just starting with a few images that bring to mind like what people think of when they see or consider discuss mutual aid. This is an image from 2020 of people doing a big food distribution project. Another food distribution image, people in some kind of community space with boxes of groceries and a sign about volunteering. These are these gorgeous free fridges that were around New York City that had been painted in very beautiful ways. This is an image of street medics supporting people at a protest. It's a really important form of mutual aid, like people doing direct support to folks at protests, giving out masks, giving out water, helping people you'll see in the lower image who've been attacked by tear gas by police. Really beautiful kind of mutual aid work. This is an image from maybe you remember in 2020 during the uprising against police violence and anti-Black racism. There was a pretty big fight with the cops here in Seattle, and a police-free zone occurred. The cops left the precinct here in my neighborhood. And this police-free zone became a place where people were gathering, talking about things, sharing skills. And what it looked like was a bunch of mutual aid tables. It's very typical of spaces that people occupy in defiance of the police, is that the actual infrastructure is people giving each other food, people handing out clothing, people offering at that cop-free zone, people were offering free haircuts, nails, mental health support, hot food, cold food. There was just, it's really useful to know that our movement spaces that we claim tend to be visually like space, like defined by mutual aid. These are images from when the campfire happened in Northern California, and a lot of people were displaced and living in the Walmart parking lot, and people were supporting each other with mutual aid, giving out blankets, clothing, tents. You can see how smoky the air was. Maybe you'll recall that eventually the cops criminalized this encampment and kicked people out. We'll be talking about criminalization of mutual aid. This is an image, I think, from Hurricane Hugo, another example of mutual aid that we see in every disaster, people coming to each other's rescue. Really noticeably, the government doesn't come and rescue people, certainly not in a timely way, certainly not in a way that's just or evenly distributed across poor and rich, white people and people of color. So it's often up to us. A few things about what mutual aid is from my perspective. Like any term, it's used by lots of people in lots of ways, but I'll share what it means to me and how I'll be talking about it today. So mutual aid is the part of our ecosystem of liberation work where we're giving each other material support to survive existing systems. Our movements also do other things like drop banners, block pipelines. We do so many things, but one thing we do that's mutual aid is when we materially support each other trying to survive existing systems. It's only mutual aid, in my opinion, if it's based in a shared analysis about the root causes of the crises. It's the systems that are to blame for the crisis, not the people in crisis. This is a distinction from charity that I'll be talking about in a moment. And to me, it's only mutual aid if it also includes an invitation to collective action. Because if we know that it's the system that's the problem and not people in crisis, then we know that to solve it, we have to get together and fight, right? And so it doesn't mean that you have to join our group to get a tent from us right now or get this food, but we're always like asking you to join the fight. Hey, we think what's happening to you is unfair, and do you want to join us in fighting for justice for everyone? So those to me are the three elements that define mutual aid. And I want to distinguish it from charity. This is like a really important part of how we define it. Charity celebrates rich people's generosity. Its origins, the origins of the charity system we have here in the United States, and I think in Canada and in Europe, come from the invention of poor relief in a period where new forms of capitalism were displacing huge numbers of people from their land. And then the rich people, the government, sometimes the church, established like these little crumbs they give out to some people that legitimize and justify the system, that say it's fair. And part of the way that works is that charity is about blaming and controlling people in crisis. While mutual aid would say people are unhoused because of a racist colonial capitalist housing market, charity systems are like, you're unhoused because there's something wrong with you. You need to take these pills. You need to become sober. You need to go to these trainings, like this kind of thing. Like you're not housing ready. All of this kind of idea of blaming people in crisis for the crisis. Charity always divides people into deserving and undeserving. There's strict eligibility criteria to receive support. Like undocumented people can't get anything here, or people with felony records can't get anything here, or you have to have children or not have children or be sober. Their idea that it's okay for some people to be left in poverty and crisis, but we'll give something out to the few people. Mutual aid is like everything for everyone. We don't distinguish. We don't judge people for being in crisis and say that some deserve support. Ultimately, charity justifies, legitimizes, and sustains the existing systems of extraction. Mutual aid wants to destroy those systems so that we don't have to live under these crises that are created by them. A background idea for me that I want to put in the mix with us, we live under a myth that social change comes from governments, corporations, media, and elites. And that the way it happens is that charismatic leaders appeal to elites and change their minds to win change. And in that story, ordinary people don't really have a big role. All we can do is like vote or donate or post on social media or go to an occasional march. This is a very disempowering mythology about how change works that also doesn't track with the history of social movements. In reality, social change happens when huge numbers of ordinary people organize to fight back and to make it impossible for the extraction and violence to continue. Ordinary people are at the center of change. And injustice is not a result of misunderstanding. It's not like, oh, the elites just don't know that genocide kills people or that fossil fuels are destroying life on Earth or that poverty shortens your life. They know, you know, it's a result of domination. So if we organize ourselves as if our only goal is to convince elites, we will never win. And they would love for us to just stay there, begging for them to change things and take care of us. Instead, we're going to take care of ourselves and force change. The final part of this reality is that our movements are only made of our relationships. Our opponents have all the money and the guns. The only thing we have is like all the people on earth who are not winning out and who are actually really endangered and dying from these conditions. So if we can't figure out how to stick together and stand up for each other and do solidarity, then they win. It really matters how we treat each other because that's all we have is like whether we build trust, know how to share, make decisions together, have generative conflict. So we'll be talking about things related to that. You can't do mutual aid work and ignore human relationships. Just falls apart. Okay. So these myths about social change that I mentioned are very demobilizing. They encourage us to limit our resistance to passive and symbolic acts. And we're supposed to expect somebody else to save us, like elected officials, nonprofits, tech billionaires, whatever. They discourage us from taking bold collective action. I want to just give you an example. These are images from the Montgomery bus boycott. A lot of us are taught a little bit about this in like elementary school, that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, and then Martin Luther King made important speeches, and then the laws changed through courts and legislatures. The real story is that the Montgomery bus boycott was a giant mutual aid project made and done by mostly working class Black women to transport tens of thousands of people everywhere they needed to go for a year and a half without the bus system. So people, they did all these huge cooking projects like you see on the left-hand side to sell food, to buy cars, to drive people around. And then people also coordinated to walk together in groups because it was quite dangerous. White supremacists were very like upset and violent about the boycott. This is an example of how ordinary people and mutual aid are written out of the stories that we hear about powerful social change. And instead, the stories are told as stories about elites. So we want to look at history differently and notice the core role we all have in mobilizing and transforming conditions. A couple other images, probably the most famous mutual aid programs in American history were the Black Panther Party's survival programs, including their free breakfast programs that happened in cities around the United States. At the time, the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, said was like the biggest threat to the United States was that the Black Panthers were serving breakfast. Such sweet pictures of these kids together. Couple more final pieces on this. When we think about mutual aid, we want to think about the history of poor relief, like welfare, Social Security, these kinds of programs we have in the United States, but there's versions of them in many places around the world, and disaster relief. Like when does the government come in or not, when the hurricane or the flood or the fire comes through. A lot of people in our culture have a fantasy of a caregiving state that will, you know, deal appropriately with pandemics or fires or floods, that will someday provide healthcare to everyone. The reality of the United States is that it's a government designed and created to cultivate white settler life. It's gotten better and better over the whole course of its existence at extracting wealth from poor people and the planet and concentrating it with a few rich people. And whenever it gives out care, it's just to like stabilize, briefly stabilize when things get too unstable with this fundamentally unstable arrangement of taking from everyone for just a few. It's by nature not caring. It's by nature colonial and violent and racist. And the sooner we let go of that fantasy, the more effective our actions can be. Whenever they give us relief, poor relief, disaster relief, it's always conditional. Oh, sorry, undocumented people can't get the COVID checks. Oh, sorry, you don't have an address, you can't, etc. It's always exclusive. It's mainly most of the relief will go to rich people, to white people, to businesses, not to people of color, to poor people. And they can just revoke it whenever things stabilize. Oh, two COVID checks is enough to get you guys not to rebel. Or the history of the US poverty welfare programs. They expand a little bit when there's big uprisings, like in the 60s and 70s and in the 1930s, and then they contract them soon thereafter because they are just using them for social control, not to actually keep people alive. People often ask about mutual aid. But isn't it all so small? How could it ever be to scale? That's probably the most common question I get. We have to change our idea about scale. The scale of the nation state is actually a very violent, brutal scale that's about extracting from most people and then giving crumbs back. And it's also like really ineffective to deal with disaster in that way. The most effective disaster relief happens at the local level. The people on your block know, oh, hey, people on this block speak Farsi, speak Spanish, or there's elders on this block who won't be able to get down from their apartments if the lights go out and there's no elevator. The scale of response for disaster is best at the local level. And the way you get a scaling up of that is not through centralization. It's not, oh, groups that are national groups that have an office in DC are the most important ones. That's a story we're told. Instead, you scale it up through collaboration and networking. So this group is experimenting with doing this in a community that has more elders. And this group over here in this part of the neighborhood is really doing this with people who have a lot more sickle cell disease. And people in this part of the neighborhood are really working on this with the part of the neighborhood that floods the most. And each of those has a wisdom and a specific way of doing it. And these people do it in a community that celebrates Eid, and that needs to look different. And then they share their best wisdom, but they don't become one big thing that tries to standardize as if we're all the same and as if the same answers happen everywhere. So it's about shifting from thinking of scale as centralization of authority and bureaucracy to thinking of scale as coordinating, connecting, sharing wisdom, sharing resources. It just comes up a lot, so I wanted to mention it. When we do effective resistance, including mutual aid, sometimes the government will copy it and offer some concessions. They'll then give something like that out. Great, let's celebrate that that's a sign of our power. Let's not then start to rely on them for it because they will take it back as soon as we're not really well organized and threatening the stability of their regimes. So we can celebrate concessions, but we shouldn't demobilize when they give something out. Or when they even sometimes we demobilize just because they like said that our thing was a problem, but then they didn't go on to do anything about it. The stakes of this work are extremely high. As you all know, we're in an ecological crisis. We're under a like terrifying fascist government. We're going to be encountering mounting disasters for the rest of our lives. The best way to prepare for disaster is to do mutual aid work right now, to build all those connections, those skills, the awareness of who's vulnerable in our communities, the ability to coordinate well. I forgot to say at the beginning, and I want to say now, I have a lot more workshops that go into deeper detail about some of the skills-based stuff for groups that I'm not going to get to today. There's a video series called Building Capacity for Mutual Aid Groups that I did that's got a bunch of videos that go into more detail with these skills. And it's all free online, and they'll share a link that links to my website where you can find all of those and the slides, and you can then do the workshops yourself for your group. The idea is to make this stuff really easy to get. Okay, so some common problems that come up in mutual aid work. One is that people take funding and then there's strings attached to it. Well, it really can make groups falter. Suddenly there's a lot of reporting requirements, or you're not allowed to serve certain communities with it, or groups get bogged down in the bureaucracy of the grant process. So that's a really common dilemma. Like, we want more money for this, but when we get it from certain sources, there's a lot of strings attached. Another problem is that a lot of people do mutual aid work that's focused primarily on giving and receiving money. I want to really name right now that we will never have enough money to beat the odds with money. So it's good for us to give and receive money, but we really need to build mutual aid work that has additional elements in it, where we're giving each other child care, elder care, visiting people in the hospital. Like, we need sometimes in 2020, a lot of groups started that just gave money to people online, and the whole thing was online. And it's meaningful and useful, but we want to build thicker relationships, more skills beyond that, because we will never have enough money to meet all the needs of the problems that they're creating for us. So a lot of groups end up being like, we raised $50,000, amazing, or $20,000, but there's somebody who needs a new trailer, and there's somebody who needs a new wheelchair, like some really high ticket things. And there's actually 20 people who are consistently unhoused or can't pay their rent and won't be able to because of the conditions that they're living under. And these aren't one-time problems for people. This can be a problem for groups when they start to fight with each other about what to do about the fact that there's not enough money or who to prioritize, right? These are just the conditions. It's not because these groups are doing anything wrong. Another common problem, how to choose who gets help. In general, mutual aid groups choose to try to give the help to the people who are the most vulnerable, which is the ethically right thing. But even inside that, do we pay three people's rent or buy one person this wheelchair? It's just, this is an impossible situation. People are tend to be in long-term need and crisis and sometimes chaotically. And I think some mutual aid groups get overwhelmed when it's, oh my God, it might take five people just to support this one person to get through day to day because of the levels of crisis this system creates in people's lives. People really struggle, of course, in the face of this with how to have boundaries. Like it's life and death work, and yet it's lifelong work. So, how do we be loving and generous and also try to do this work for our whole lifetimes, which means not burn out our group in the first few months? And this is a real challenge. We're going to talk about solutions to these things. And some of these pressures can create conflict in groups. And a lot of groups that I work with blame themselves for the pressures. It's the conditions, it's not us. Of course, this work is hard. So, how can we hold that these conditions didn't come from our group doing anything wrong? So, what helps? Remembering that we can't do it perfectly. We talk about this work as imperfect people doing imperfect work. We're all learning how to think and feel together. We're learning new solidarities. We all come into the work not knowing everything we could about all the systems we live under. So we might show up and not interrogated our transphobia yet, or have a lot to learn about ableism, or are noticing the ways that racism is impacting how we behave. How can we let ourselves be imperfect and be learners together? Really hard, but really important. Like getting rid of perfectionist standards, which in my opinion are white supremacist and capitalist standards usually. The conditions are the problem, not us. So can we not blame each other for things that are the conditions? It really helps to listen to each other carefully and not need to get our own way. This is a new skill for most of us because we live in a system where at work and at school, we're usually taught to try to be right, get our own way, dominate others, or just fold to others' authority to get by. So we're trying something different, which is to really care what everyone in this group thinks, find the best wisdom together, be able to be like, I could live with that. Let's do that if it's going to bring the group forward instead of getting hung up on my one idea and needing it to be just so. Trusting the wisdom of the group. This is really important because we are all pretty afraid of giving and receiving feedback in this culture because it's a society defined by imprisonment and we're afraid of being thrown away. And we're afraid if we give someone feedback, they'll be defensive. And most of us are pretty defensive. And we mostly are in really hierarchical environments like schools and jobs and families where the feedback only goes one way. We're not very good at feedback. And so then we don't tell people when something they're doing is hard for us. And then we talk behind their back, or we get so mad we blow up eventually, but we never told them along the way, or we just disappear from the group. So, how can we learn more about direct feedback so that we don't gossip or blow up or disappear? And I have some workshops about this at that same link on my website, deanspade.net, building capacities for mutual aid groups. So I want to talk about a few mutual aid principles that really guide us. I'm keeping my eye on the time. One is, like I mentioned, this is the cornerstone of mutual aid. The system, not the people suffering under it, creates poverty, crisis, and vulnerability. Two, and part of that is a commitment to the dignity and self-determination of people in need or crisis. Charity treats people in crisis like they need to be fixed by the charity. There's this kind of real top-down, paternalistic, usually racist kind of framework. Mutual aid is like people know what they need. We're going to listen to people and assume they know what they need. And it doesn't mean we, of course, still have to have a group process around what we're prioritizing, and people in need differ on their opinions about that. But there's a fundamental respect that people in crisis have dignity and don't need to be fixed or bossed around. Mutual aid is about making a long-term commitment. In our culture, in charity culture, there's an idea like maybe if you wanted to be a good person, you'd go to a soup kitchen on Thanksgiving and help out for one night, and maybe you would take a selfie about it, right? Like you'd have a pet cause that you do something about once in a while. Mutual aid is about deciding that our lives are dedicated to liberation and that we're going to go deep in a project that can really support people in crisis. And an example I often use is after the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, there was a big uprising, and some people started a jail support project. They were seeing how people are released from jail and often get arrested right away. So they set up a project to wait outside the jail. And when people came out, offer them, do you need a ride? Do you need warm clothes? Do you need to make some phone calls? So they wouldn't just get picked up again trying to get home or get their basic needs met. A project like that, you do it and you keep learning more about how to do it better. Oh, we need to have a Spanish speaker with us. Oh, we should come here earlier on Tuesdays because they let people out at this time. Whatever, you learn more as you go about what it means to do this well, and you keep deepening. You know, if you're doing eviction defense, if you're doing support to help people who've had their wages stolen, like everything you do, you learn more like, oh, what does this community really need? Who are we accidentally leaving out? What does it mean to have deeper solidarity, be more effective, respond to new conditions? So it's about a long-term commitment, not just a flash in the pan. Mutual aid projects work best when they have open meetings and pathways for new people to join. Most people join social movements through mutual aid. We need to have much bigger movements in order to survive, much less win. Our society is very demobilized, and we need tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people involved in our movements in order to fight back. So we need a lot of people to join. And most people join through mutual aid either because they need something and they go to the only people offering it. And those people are like, yeah, it's messed up that you don't have that. Do you want to join the fight? Or they're like, I'm so upset that this thing is happening in my community. I want to help people. Maybe it happened to me before. Maybe I heard about it on the news. And then they join. They're a really big entry point for people into movements who then sometimes go deeper into mutual aid. Some of them will go deeper into direct action and be blocking pipelines soon or whatever. But it's a really important entry point. And also, many mutual aid projects, if they don't think about incorporating new people, will get really small because, like, a few people will have to leave or get sick or move or have a kid or whatever. And then soon the project is four people and they can't possibly, they're burning out, whatever. So it's really important to have ways to let new people in and to have new people take on real roles, like really deeply oriented to how decision making works, to how they can really be heard and participate, not just like accidentally have like the founders of the project really be the bosses. That doesn't work. It leads to burnout. And also, people aren't going to hang out and do unpaid work to be bossed around. They need to really get to participate. The exception I would give to this is that some mutual aid projects, of course, have different security needs. If you're giving out medical procedures or medicines that are illegal where you live, you might like not be open to every brand new person who might be a cop, So but most mutual aid projects that are doing food, childcare, disaster prep, ideally are open to new people and good at bringing new people in. Mutual aid projects tend to engage in political education with members. So when I enter the project, I might be like, I'm so upset about what's happening to immigrant children at the border. And then I get into the migrant justice group and I learn, oh, I also care about adults. And then I find out, wow, the immigration system is like brutal for people with disabilities and it's super anti-Black. And my solidarities grow through doing the work. And that'll happen both informally through meeting the other people in the project. And while we're putting all these sandwiches into bags, we start talking about what we know about things and what's making us frustrated. And we teach each other things organically. And a lot of groups also do political education sessions. Like we're going to have a disability justice training for our group, something like that. I mentioned this. To do this work, we have to all learn a lot more about how to give and receive feedback, how to have humility and learn in public. It's rough skill set in this society, but it's the difference between whether we can have useful conflict and learn from each other or just fall apart. As part of that, a lot of mutual aid groups put some time into building conflict resolution skills and processes with members. And I have a lot more information about that in those other workshops that I mentioned. Most of us don't know anything about how to have conflict in generative ways. People in our society are taught to like ignore conflict and avoid it or burn bridges and ditch people. And so, how do we learn how to have a useful conflict and learn things and become better able to care for each other and expand our thinking? Mutual aid projects tend to value transparency. This is a real distinction from charity and like nonprofits where you're like, who's getting paid what? And where'd that money come from? Mutual aid projects, you'll see people posting on social media. We took in $2,000. We bought 30 sleeping bags and 400 bottles of water. And, that kind of transparency is really good for community trust and for making sure the group itself is operating according to its principles. There's been a big trend over many decades in the US. I think a difference between the 1960s, 70s moment of revolutionary work and now is more groups use consensus-based decision making because people realize it doesn't work when you have bosses. When you have bosses, one, it's easier for law enforcement to pick them off or infiltrate and become the boss. Two, people don't stick around to be bossed around doing unpaid work, like I said. And also voting, having it be like a majority rule thing really doesn't work because then we have a vote and the people who lost the vote and they're going to leave the group if now the work is happening in a way that they don't like. So consensus-based decision making, which I have a whole training on in one of those videos, which may be useful if that's a new concept, is where you're just like, let's figure out something that works for everyone, including it doesn't have to be everyone's favorite thing. So part of this is building this skill that I noted in the slide, the skill of desiring other people's participation. So I bring a proposal and I actually want people in the group to tell me what they don't like about it, what it's missing, so that it gets more and more support to be as good as it can possibly be for this group so that we all support it and we all implement it. I don't want to just get my proposal voted for if a bunch of people don't like it, because then it probably won't really happen because we're all doing this work unpaid. I want to hear what others think could be better. It's really vital. It's a skill that we don't really have living in a society where we're usually at work or at school, either being dominated or trying to dominate. I wanted us to look at this chart. Someone's going to put it in the chat, the link to this chart. And in the chat, spend a little moment having a look at the chart. And in the chat, talk about what stands out to you or what you recognize in groups that you've been part of. The chart is linked self-determination. Yeah, I'm just curious, what are people seeing? People are questioning hierarchies, giving things away without expectations. Somebody mentions that deprofessionalized, right? Like we're trying to have mutual aid work doesn't need to be professionalized. It's not siloed. Yeah. Thank you. Decentralized. Yep. Members aren't people who donate, they're people who actually participate. That's very different between charity and mutual aid. Yeah, people being willing to beg, borrow, and steal to get what we need, like long histories of people doing mutual aid projects entirely based on stolen medical supplies from their jobs. A passion issue rather than a job, exactly. Charity is more about control. Great. Yeah, someone mentions the charity side seems very 501(c)(3). Yeah, most nonprofits operating on a charity model, almost all of them. Great. Someone mentions disconnected from other issues. Yeah, like a lot of times in charities, this charity is about homeless people, but it's completely disconnected from anything that's about refugees or gender and sexual based violence. These things are all like these little silos, often determined by philanthropists. Yeah. Conflict, not being good at conflict. Great. Everyone is a volunteer in most mutual aid projects, so we have to resolve conflict. Yeah. Charity is seen as a top-down grace. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, and someone asked, are we saying that all nonprofits are bad? I am not saying that. I've been part of lots of nonprofits, but the nonprofit system, and there's a really amazing book about this called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's edited by Insight. And I also have a series of videos on my website called Nonprofit Blues, which might be useful to some people, queer dreams and nonprofit blues. But the nonprofit system emerged actually as a result, like the kind of growth in that sector emerged as a result of the kind of backlash to the 1960s and 70s movements. There was this shift from, in those movements, there was an enormous amount of mutual aid and grassroots work happening. And then there was a kind of professionalization of charity work and the idea that social justice is like a career track and that everybody else who doesn't have that job just waits and does nothing or sends a donation. It's part of this bigger picture. And I think most people who work in nonprofits, and I know it's been my experience, can see how the funding system actually controls what nonprofits do, right? Like nonprofits are funded by our opponents mostly. Like they're mostly funded by wealthy people and the government. So that really limits what they can do. There are some nonprofits that do something I would call mutual aid, but mostly nonprofits don't get to do mutual aid. There's limits on who they can serve, and their agenda is defined by philanthropy. People call it philanthropic control. Anyway, there's a lot more out there about that. I also did a talk, maybe someone could find a link to it and put in the chat, called Should Social Movement Work Be Paid? And I think it's got a little bit more about that history and like some of the problems that do happen when we try to be paid for all of our social movement work. So I want to talk about group culture. It's so important when we're creating mutual aid groups to create a group culture that we can sustain, where we treat each other well, where we work together in ways that are effective, where we respond to changing conditions. So groups have cultures, all groups have cultures. They include the signals we give out to people when they first come in. Like, how does it feel here? Like, is it warm or cold? Does it feel like a space that's multiracial or it's just for white people? Is it a space that has a certain age dynamic? Is it a space where we have fun and celebrate, or a place where people are very serious? Are we punctual or late? Do we gossip or give direct feedback? Is there a sense of scarcity that drives the whole thing and rushing, or is there kind of faith and abundance? These are just cultural norms. These cultural norms are usually created by the people who started the group, but they can also change as new people come in, and they can change when we intentionally try to change them. It's really useful. And I just want to name that trauma, overwhelming community need, urgency, a real lack of resources, these things do influence the culture of our resistance groups, and they impact the people working on them. We didn't invent these problems, right? Yet we can work on trying to change the group culture. And one thing I notice is that the reason I'm giving you a series of charts like this to look at in this workshop, and these charts are also in the book Mutual Aid, which you can find free online at the Anarchist Library. The point of these charts is if we look at them together in the group, we can be like, huh, what's this like? What are we noticing? Instead of having a fight with each other where I'm like, you make us all late or you rush us all, right? Like, could we see these things as norms? So I want you all, I'm asking the folks at Shareable to put the group culture chart into the chat. And let's say in the chat to each other, what stands out in the chart? What tendencies do you witness in groups that you are part of or work with? And this could include friend groups, family groups, sharing work well. Great. Flaky. People are flaky in this person's group. Yeah. People are flexible or experimental, insular and clicky. I hear a lot of complaints about that. I think that's really something for us all to work on that can drive new people away. Conflict avoidant, people being not dependable, that's really hard on groups. A few people doing most of the work. Savior complex, people being welcoming and easeful. The founder as the boss, that's a really common thing. It's not good for that person. It's not good for anyone else. It's normal and not about judgment, but we got to move away from it. Martyrdom, overworking. We're going to talk more about that later in this session. Virtue signaling, confusion and gatekeeping. Yeah, some groups, people are like, how does anything get done here? How do these decisions get made? How do we make this more transparent? Great. So just even noticing what's in the tendencies and being like, huh, and just with the group being like, yeah, we do have a tendency of this kind or that kind. What would it be like for us to try to shift that instead of being blamey to each other? What helps us move towards the aspirational qualities in the chart. When you look at the chart and see things, I'm so sorry. Someone's asking if we can show the chart on the screen. Unfortunately, it's too many words that would be really hard to see on the screen. And also, these links will be in the follow-up email and everything that Shareable sends out. Yeah, what helps us? So people say direct communication from an understanding of compassion. Yeah, can we be kind to people and be like, ah, what if we tried to change this to build more trust? Listening can really help change this stuff. Open communication, being able to hold conflict and repair. Someone says being the one to initiate change. Yeah, like not being afraid to say, hey guys, I think that the way we are moving is driving new people away or is like keeping us from trusting each other or whatever. Yeah, this is really great. This chat is so wonderful. Thank you all for all that you're sharing. Yeah, creating and welcoming multiple points of entry. That's so great. I think some groups I've been in, we have like a monthly orientation for new members or a quarterly orientation for new members. And then we also have a dinner once a month. And then maybe once in a while we have a party related to a holiday that's relevant to us, like giving people lots of ways in. Or maybe we're tabling at something in the community. Someone says potlucks. Love it. Okay. There's so much here. I'm going to keep going even though I like just want to do this with you forever. It's like the things you're saying are so genius. Something I just have to put in this presentation, it's so important to me, is that mutual aid includes rule breaking and law breaking. And there's this image of this graffiti that I really love here that says, stop believing in authority, start believing in each other. And I really wanted to put this in because I actually just saw it. My friend Peter Gelderloos, who's an author of many beautiful books, one of his most recent books, which is called They'll Beat the Memory Out of Us, he says something like, any effective political tactic we do, they will eventually criminalize. And that is so true. You see this. You see the criminalization of handing out food in parks. You see the criminalization of blocking the highway. You see the criminalization of wearing a mask at a protest, all of these things. And so we should know, especially now when they're criminalizing the kinds of healthcare we need, whether that's trans healthcare or abortion, when they're criminalizing people being in public, like I live in Seattle where they've passed new kind of drug war style laws that are like, creating these sex work free zones and these drug free zones. They're doing so much to close public space, to stigmatize our communities, and to make our resistance illegal. We are going to have to break laws and rules. Everyone doesn't have to choose to do that, but the more of us who back up those who do, and the more of us who learn how to keep a good secret, especially for people like nurses, teachers, social workers, people who are on the front lines of enforcing the worst rules coming from the government, we need to learn how to do a clandestine thing together, keep a secret, and connect with somebody who maybe you wouldn't have known had your values and be like form that relationship. I told you earlier about the kind of myth of social change. I would consider that like a liberal myth that tells us that all of our resistance work should be through official channels. Like we should appeal to the government and we should have a permitted march. They want us to do everything above ground. We need a vibrant underground. We need to hide people from ICE. We need to hide people from the cops. We need to break the law together. That's part of how we're going to get through this, if to the extent that we are. So I wanted to put that in the center and I wanted to show some pictures to inspire us. This is 2020. The city of Los Angeles was going to come and clear an encampment of unhoused people out of Echo Park. And housing justice activists learned about the dates at which the sanitation trucks were going to come, throw everybody's homes away who were living in Echo Park. And they went and blocked the trucks with their bodies. I love these images. Gives me goosebumps. People are like, no, fuck no. You cannot clear people out of this park who are barely trying to survive. So then there was like a period where Los Angeles stopped clearing out that park for months and months during the early part of the pandemic. And there became a vibrant community of unhoused people and so much mutual aid in the park. People had set up solar showers. And all it was like really beautiful mutual aid practice happening there. And then the city decided to clear it. They spent millions, literally millions of dollars that could be spent on housing with this huge armed raid of the park. Thousands of people showed up to try to defend the encampment. The city managed to clear the encampment and put a 16-mile fence all the way around Echo Park that stayed up until pretty recently. So just again, us remembering what's at stake here. They are terrified of us taking up public space, helping each other survive. The stakes are very high. The work is very important. Another example, I think this is from 2017, Nashville, Tennessee. This guy comes home, he's in his van. ICE has come to arrest him. His neighbors surrounded his van, held hands, and stayed for hours until ICE left. Maybe some of you are part of rapid response networks where you live that are forming, people trying to learn how to coordinate to block ICE arrest. This is so moving to me, so beautiful. We can actually defend our neighbors. Another example, maybe some of you followed Moms for Housing in Oakland. These Black moms moved their families into empty, foreclosed housing in Oakland, and then their community rallied around them and stood outside all night every night to protect them from police raids. They stayed there for a while. Ultimately, these are the cops that were sent to clear them out. Look at how militarized this is. It's so disgusting, but it tells us what the stakes of this work are. It always makes me ask the question, how many of us would have to be there to stop these raids? There's a book I really love called In Defense of Looting by this brilliant trans author, Vicky Osterweil. She has all these stories about resistance that are really inspiring for this moment. And one of them is about how in the 1930s, the height of the Great Depression, there's massive amounts of eviction happening all over the country. And there were these eviction riots, where that's what they were sometimes called, or they were also called flying squadrons. And basically, groups of people would know an eviction was happening and gather hundreds, sometimes thousands of people to go to that apartment or house and refuse to let the eviction happen, sit on all the furniture, fill up the space, and not let the cops or marshals go forward with the eviction. It was like so beautiful. It happened in Detroit, New York City, all these places. The research shows that 77,000 families had their evictions prevented this way in the early 1930s. A third of New York City evictions. 77,000 in New York City in the early 30s. So just thinking about that's not like a drop in the pan. That's not like a little tiny, like if we were coordinated to take these risks together, we could actually stop the violence of these systems. That's what I'm imagining. How many people, how do we need to get together, get more people to participate and to be brave and be willing to break rules? And it's so much safer when we do it together. If just a few people try to do it, yeah, they'll get arrested. But if 1,000 people do it together, you could just actually stop the cops. Okay, I'm going to move us on just because trying to get through a few pieces before we have our Q&A. So I want to talk about perfectionism and procrastination because there's such big obstacles in mutual aid work. And most of us live with, I would say, both of them. Maybe some people here think they're not a perfectionist. I used to think I was not a perfectionist because I was like, I do everything terribly. That's a perfectionist thinking. I'm like, oh, I'm such a mess because I'm a perfectionist. So most of us live with both, and perfectionism and rigid judgment in our movements is really common. We're so afraid that if we make one mistake or say the wrong thing, people will leave us, judge us, talk about us behind our backs, never speak to us again. Living with that is really bad for the culture of groups. We want people to be able to ask questions, raise concerns. We don't want to silence ourselves. Then we won't create authentic relationships, talk about the really complex issues that are actually in the room. It can also impede our boldness. If we're so afraid of making a mistake, we might not try something really intense and really important, right? We need the boldest tactics possible because literally everything we're fighting is life and death for the individuals in our community who are in crisis and also for the earth, right? Like it's time. It is time to take the risks. But if we're afraid of making a mistake, we might never get around to building the trust to take really bold action. Perfectionism and procrastination show up differently for different people. Some of us, it's that we never join a group because we are like endlessly researching. Some of us never complete our task because we're afraid, we sign up for a task in the group and then we're like judging ourselves and putting it off and watching TV or doing some other task and we never finish our task and then we feel guilty, like we're bad people and it feeds a cycle of shame. There's so many ways it shows up, but it's like it can also create a lot of conflict. Like I said, I would do these tasks and I didn't do them. And so then I don't come to the next meeting. Like it's just really hard on us. And for some people, it's coming from a feeling of imposter syndrome. Like everyone else here knows things I don't know. They're all going to find out I don't belong here, stuff like that. And the pressures of being in leadership, just being part of a group, can make people kind of like afraid to act. And one way that it looks for a lot of people is difficulty prioritizing tasks. Oh my God, there's so much going on in life and I don't know what to do next. One thing I recommend that everyone try that I learned in the 12-step program, Workaholics Anonymous, which I really also recommend reading the literature or joining that program if you have any kind of problem with overworking or avoiding work. But one tool is creating a prioritized list for yourself. It can be so exhausting to every time you sit down to work on stuff, be like, what do I work on now? And then you end up working on the thing that wasn't that important and you never did the thing that was really important. So just creating a prioritized list for me is like creating a little love note to myself tomorrow morning and the next time I sit down so that I actually work on the thing that I need to work on instead of having avoidance and procrastination and shame drive this like chaotic relationship to my tasks. I want to say to you all, I think that one of the dominant emotional states in today's society is the feeling of avoidance. The feeling like, "Ugh, I don't want to call my grandmother. I don't want to work on the spreadsheet for the group. I don't want to go to work. I don't want to go out with my friends. I don't want to have sex with my partner." Like everyone feels just like, "Oh my God, I can't possibly." That's the feeling of an overwhelming society and a society based on coercion where you haven't gotten to choose very often in your life what you wanted to do. It's been like, we must do this for work or school or family. And if we don't, we'll be like left in the gutter. There's like this high stakes forced work. And it can be really hard when you get stuck in that feeling, when you practice that all the time. Then you join a mutual aid group and they're like, here, will you help us with this spreadsheet to make sure everybody, all the people in the local prison get the letters we were supposed to send them? And you're like, "Ugh, spreadsheets, that, instead of feeling like, yes, I'm doing what I really believe in. I'm helping people in crisis right now. I'm part of a group. You just default, right? We all just default to that avoidant feeling. So I want to talk about that avoidant feeling as an internal habit that can drive procrastination. So in the chat, I'm curious if people will write about this. Think about a task or a type of work you avoid or procrastinate. How does the avoidance feel in your body? Like for me, it feels like I want to back off from it. I've heard people say they feel tired. Someone says dry eyes, anxiety, heartburn, dread, pit in my stomach, anxious, back pain, heavy, pinch, stomach ache, cloudy head, tired, spiraling, despair, panicked, sleepy. A lot of people get fatigue when they feel avoidant. Sharp pains, irritable, shameful, exhausted, tightness. Yeah, need to lie down. Some people are like, I just want to go watch media. We live in a time when the world's literally ending and they've given us the best TV and video games ever. It's not a coincidence and it's really bad, right? So, like, uh-oh, I just lost all my time and didn't do what I meant to do. Okay. So, the alternative to this is I love people writing the very funniest things in the chat. The alternative to this is feeling on purpose, like knowing why I want to move forward. For me, it's like, oh yeah, like I care about people having housing. I care about everybody who's locked up. I care about everybody who's being put through this kind of poverty. Maybe I'm connecting to my own memories and experiences of being in jail or being poor, all the things that have happened, right? Being alone, like not having support. So for me, it's like that question, what's that feeling inside? What's it like when you feel on purpose? For me, it's like my spine feels upright. I feel forward. Let's go. And I will tell you, I have a lot of avoidance when it's time to write, and I write a lot. And so I have to be like, I have to bring in on purpose, right? So people are saying fired up, energized, inspired, expansion, joyful, ready for flight. Someone says on purpose is like the transition into labor. That's cool. Buzzing, clear, on fire, peaceful but energetic. Yeah, centered, giddy. I can think more clearly, confident, expansive, in the zone. My belief is that we can cultivate the feeling of on purpose, even to do a spreadsheet, even to visit an elder in the neighborhood who you actually don't really like, but you love. You know what I mean? Like, even to go do childcare when you're like, right now, I'm annoyed by 3-year-olds. I believe we can cultivate this feeling and then we have to. Oh, unshakable. I love the word unshakable. Thank you for writing that in. It's like a matter of being like, I refuse to be organized by this distraction society. I am going to choose to be organized by my true desire. Mutual aid work and all social movement work includes a lot of boring or laborious or tedious tasks. It's like a lot of diaper changing. It's a lot of delivering the food. It's a lot of talking to someone who other people find difficult, whatever. And so, how do I cultivate the on purpose feeling? I do it before I start a task. You can do it together before a meeting. Are we going to read a poem aloud? Are we going to do a go round of why we're here, one word check in? What are we going to do by myself or with others to cultivate that? To cultivate that feeling of on purpose, to know why I am doing this and to have that fuel me. If I have to do something alone, like at the computer, can I imagine the people from my group with me or my ancestors or the trees? Or can I tap into the resistance of all the people who've ever been locked up or all the people who've ever fought the colonizer? How can I remember that I'm part of something? I'm not alone. The last thing, which is very related to this, is this other chart I want us to look at. This chart is directly from the program Workaholics Anonymous. It is about working compulsively versus working joyfully. And in the chat, I'd love to hear from people. What stands out in the chart? What can you relate to? And anything about what helps you move toward working more joyfully. It's very hard. We have to cultivate the joy. It's not going to happen for us, right? False deadlines, someone says. Being playfully responsive to others. Being tightly scheduled can make us be compulsive. Setting boundaries can move us towards joyful working. Yeah, a lot of us feel a lot of impatience. It's like work, the word work. I wish we had another work. I'm writing a book that's a sequel to my current book, Love in a Fucked Up World, and it's called Getting Shit Done in a Fucked Up World. Because I don't want to use the word work, because work reminds us of like homework and working a wage job. These things are not, we're trying to go for this other feeling. Like, how do we feel? Someone said mentally scattered. How do we feel collected and forward towards what we believe in, even when we're doing stuff that's hard? For me, even just reading the chart helps me. Just reread the chart, Dean. Yeah. Going slow. Someone says that helps them. Yeah. Taking breaks for treats. Nice. I mean, often I light a candle before I do a task that I'm stressed out about. Sometimes I'll get on a phone with a friend, or I'll be like, I'm texting you at the start, at the end, or I'll be like, Friday morning, will you meet me and we'll both do the thing that we both are avoiding? We'll do it together from 9 to 10 a.m. and we'll text during it. Something like that. Setting a timer, setting boundaries, breathing. People are so smart. Love all this. Being aware of our moods, co-working, calling someone you love, praying, dancing. I really heavily rely on this poem. It's called Life Chant by Diane DePrima. I really find that poem helps me orient to what I care about. This is my final image. I love this image by Seth Bachman. People pulling themselves out of the water. We the people must help each other. The government does not care. That is the truth. It's not going to become a caring government. It's certainly not right now. And let me tell you, it doesn't matter who's elected next time. It's a deportation machine. It's a wealth concentration machine. It's a racism machine. And our job is to take care of each other, especially the people who are getting the least care, and fight back.
Excellent. Thank you. That was quite the whirlwind. We currently have 50 open questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We're not going to get to all of these. I will say that we're saving all of these questions. We're going to be posting a discussion thread on on Canvas, and we'll post every single one of these questions in that discussion thread. And so what we know is that the 1,000 people that have shown up to this thing live and over 2,000 that have registered for this, between the group, as you can see in the chat, we have most of the answers that Dean would answer as an individual. We have as the collective, and so we're gonna need to lean on the collective after this session is over, as we just have 15 minutes left. So again, we'll post a link to Canvas to be able to sign in there, and we'll make sure all of these questions that got posted today get added to Canvas tomorrow. I'll also say that we do have 3 more straight kind of education sessions, and we will be covering a lot of the topics that people are asking questions about in more depth in those sessions. So definitely encourage folks to sign up for those as well. Please bear with us. As I mentioned, we now have 60 questions in the chat. It's loading up. We're not going to get to all of them. And thank you for putting them all in there, but we will make sure we add them to Canvas. I'm going to start with one, which is a pretty weighted question that I think a number of groups have struggled with. And this specific question is focused on infighting within groups. The person who asked the question uses the example of the genocide in Gaza, which has torn apart their every community that they've been in. And there's many, this is one example, but there's many polarized things that come up that can tear apart groups. And so they're wondering, how do we address this level of really intense conflict when we're trying to work together?
Yeah, I spent my life in the movement for Palestine solidarity and also in the movement for trans liberation and also for police and prison abolition. And each of these three things are things that are very polarizing or have been in groups I've been part of, where a lot of people are coming to the group or to our movements not knowing a lot about those conversations, especially like before 2020, most people hadn't heard about abolition. And so I think part of it is just being willing to spend our whole lives encountering the new people, sharing what we think, hearing their pushback, especially when people are learning new ideas. Sometimes they have to have these like spasms of no. It doesn't mean they're not listening or engaging. And I'm still going to hold my position. So we want to become people who are permeable to others' ideas. Like also when I'm the newbie to the idea, I want to be permeable, right? Like most of us have so much to learn about COVID and disability justice in a society that denies chronic illness and denies like the pandemic itself, right? Like I want to be open to learning and I also want to hold firm. I don't need to let go of a position just because someone disagrees. Sometimes in groups, conflict does lead to group splitting, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like when we over need consensus, that can be a problem. Like it could be that we need to have two groups that try it two different ways, right?
Mhm.
Or the other piece of it is, can we make sure we're not undermining other groups? There's a long history of a non-abolitionist group working on an issue and an abolitionist group working on an issue, and then the non-abolitionists undermining the abolitionists and going and working with the cops. No. So we do need to stand up to our fellow movement members when it's about undermining people who are taking the more bold position. We want to always orient towards caring for people doing the bolder work instead of undermining one another. And if you find yourself saying other people are not pragmatic enough and they should work as insiders more, you're probably undermining people doing bolder work. Most people in the United States have been fed a lot of pro-cop, pro-Israel, pro-military nonsense our whole lives. And a lot of transphobic nonsense and homophobic nonsense. And we really need to both be patient with new people and hold firm. And this is really complicated. And that's why none of us can do it alone. And if we're primarily arguing like on the internet with strangers, no. We need groups of people who are like us. One thing I say to everybody is if you're the most radical person you know, you got to expand your friend circles and find some people who challenge you because otherwise you're just being pulled in the wrong direction by the people you're connecting with. Like we all need to find some support, expanding our solidarities and not get stuck. I do a lot of work around Palestine and I'm Jewish. And it's like important for me not to spend all my time arguing with liberal Zionists. They would love to have just argue with me forever. Nope, I got to also have some people to work with who share my connection to Palestine solidarity work and then make calculated decisions. Am I wasting my time with this liberal Zionist group or institution? Or actually, are we moving them? And that's a hard thing to know. I got to talk to my fellows and be like, huh, is this movable right now? Or am I beating my head against the wall? And I got to check out my own energy levels. How does it feel? How's my on purpose doing with this fight? Conflict is part of our movements because we're in a permanent struggle against like colonialism and capitalism and racism and stuff. One other thing I'll say about this, figuring out, am I arguing with someone who's actually a target, like they need to move and shift? And I want to use tactics that might include like, naming it publicly, or am I arguing with someone close in my community who I want to move, I want to organize towards the right thing? So this question I always think, are you going to DM them or are you going to post about them? Don't post about people when you should be DMing them, right? Like,
Yeah.
like sometimes we treat our close inside people who could actually be moved like they're a target, like they're the university president or the mayor. Now, am I doing this to humiliate someone else? I think it's completely fine to want to humiliate the mayor about his bad politics, but it's not really ideal to start humiliating people who are movable people in my immediate genre of resistance. These are very subtle, complex questions that we need each other to figure out.
Yep.
And make sure, am I not just reacting and trying to get attention or trying to make others feel bad or operating on some internalized vengeance stuff from our society? Very complicated. That's why I need my friends. I need to make sure I have people I trust politically to work out these really hard questions with. And sometimes we're going to get it wrong.
Yep. And Adrienne Marie Brown wrote a great book, We Will Not Cancel Us, which goes into greater depth about that and explores the nuance of how to engage rather than to push people away. I have a follow-up question for you. There was a lot of people that were asking about consensus building, and you mentioned earlier about the potential for when you bring new people into a group that the purpose or the radical nature of the group can get diluted. You use the example around abolitionists organizing. Can you speak to utilizing consensus and the balance between consensus between everyone in a group that you've brought in and the original meaning or purpose of a group?
Yeah. I think one thing that's really useful is in order to keep your group like tied to its radical purposes, like having that, like writing down your principles. I've been in groups and we at the very beginning wrote down, we're not going to accept funding for this group because we could see how we were working on something where a lot of groups institutionalized, or this group will always be committed to disability justice, and that's what this means to us, or this group is abolitionist. So then people can join and they don't have to be abolitionists, but the group is, and that we've been transparent about that. Maybe they're joining the group
Yeah.
because they also have had this certain experience in the hospital or whatever the thing is we're working on, right? That's one piece of it. And then the other piece is, what does it really mean to support people's political development in the group? Like when new people come in, one thing that really helps is to make sure people have a chance to say what they're upset about that made them come. Like you can't just fold people into a meeting and just go with the agenda. People need to be heard when they're entering political life. So that's why it's good to have like an orientation meeting that's once a month or quarterly so that new people get to have a go around that lets them show who they are more, lets them show what they're connected to. When people have gotten to make that emotional and kind of political, spiritual connection with others, they're going to be more open to hearing the next level of solidarity that they might not have encountered before. And we want to make sure that's tied in. Like we want to be like in the orientation, we want to orient you to some key principles of solidarity and why. And there's plenty of room to ask questions. And these are our principles of solidarity here. And you don't have to fully believe in them yet, but we want to have a conversation with you because this is how the group rolls. Right. And
Yep.
this could change. Like anything the group already believes could change through a consensus process. Somebody would have to propose that you change the principles of the group,
Yep.
and there'd have to be an actual process instead of the group not really having clear principles and then it being like it just changed because there was new people here and now suddenly everyone's like no drug users or something really not cool could creep in. That's very common societally. So I think
Yep.
I'm not saying we have to have a lot of bureaucracy, but it's useful for groups if they know they've got a few principles that might be pretty bold and important solidarity things to say it explicitly to each other and make sure to orient the new people to it.
Have another question here about how to engage with mutual aid when having ongoing mental health or other issues or other disabilities. And wondering if you can speak to that at all.
That's a great question. Honestly, communities of people with disabilities are some of the places where the most mutual aid happens because people with disabilities are like abandoned by our society and have to do so much to get basic needs met. So many of the most brilliant mutual aid practices can be seen in those communities. I think part of it is like stuff that affects everyone, having boundaries, remembering that we can ask for help from our fellows. One of the things I think is a benefit of doing mutual aid work is actually having more people in our lives to support us.
Yep.
So many people in our society are isolated, live alone, don't have friends who would visit them in the hospital or bring them soup
Mhm.
or talk to them when things are really hard. Building those relationships through communities where we have the same passionate interest in liberation can make our whole lives richer and more supported. And then we need to build mutual aid groups that are not ableist so that we can actually care about people who come in, understand when people are like, I can't do this or I can't do that, or in order to do this, I need this support. Actually, teach each other and learn about ableism so that it's not hard for people who are currently having
Mm.
a mental health crisis or disability stuff come up to participate. We all need to commit to that.
I'm wondering if you can speak to mutual aid organizing in rural communities or small towns. There's a few different questions that have been framed around rural or, hey, I'm in a really small place. It's hard to find people. How do I get started, from that perspective?
Yeah. One thing I think is really useful is like disaster prep mutual aid is something people can start anywhere. I have a friend in his area. He just like put out some flyers and was like, does anybody want to come? We'll all talk about how to turn off our utilities in the event of these certain disasters. So it wasn't like you had to have a certain politics or anything. It was just like, let's meet each other. And they made the flyers in English and Spanish because that was relevant to that spot. And then people showed up and then they started to figure out what other connections do we have. Oh, some people here want to also do outreach to folks living in RVs in this parking lot. Some folks want to do some work related to family members in the local prison or the prison that's 600 miles away, whatever the case may be, right? And so that's one way. Another way is to figure out if there's anything nearby, like if somewhere nearby there's a radical bookstore or an anarchist space or a food not bombs happening in a park or start something that becomes a hub, like where will people meet each other? But sometimes just go where there is any action, even if it's 2 counties over, they might know somebody who lives where you live. Or if there is some project that hasn't a presence on the internet somehow, but it's in another part of the state, they still might know people where you are. So I found that kind of like doing that kind of networking. Maybe they're not working on the thing you most want to work on, but they're just going to know more people in the milieu. Like people who are doing this kind of work tend to know other people doing it, even on different issues. So you just got to get in somehow. And our communities, our work, we don't have big advertisements. We are harder to find. And so you got to be a little bit
Yep.
sleuthy, but it's absolutely happening in rural places. It's often happening around trailer parks. It's happening around people being released from prisons and jails into those communities. It's happening around battles about like land and pollution, like there's so many pieces around farming, around food distribution. Like you can find some people who care about some part of what you care about. And then like, how are we going to collaborate together?
All right, I'm going to ask one final question and then do a quick wrap up before to make sure we get done on time. This person wrote that they have found in many, if not most, organizing spaces that organizing itself is narrowly defined as appeals to the state via protest, public comment, etc. And they find convincing people around doing it ourselves to be incredibly difficult. It's like a mental block. What
Yeah.
ways have you found useful in helping people make this mental shift?
I think actually doing stuff. I think so many people right now are angry and scared because of the Trump administration and newly interested in doing something, but then they're like, am I supposed to just donate to the ACLU? I don't think it's going to work suing them. Like, so how do we get people? We have to invite people. And we have to invite people a lot of times. Like, we're having a film screening about this cool political history, and we're also having a barbecue on the block, and we're also having a how to make your own go bag party. Like, we just need to invite the shit out of everyone and that because it is a huge hump to leave that kind of isolation and join others. And so we just need to make it irresistible. And I just want to acknowledge that's hard. And yet it is what movements have always done.
All right. Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions. Thank you everyone for showing up. There's a number of links that are being added in the chat right now. Want to encourage folks to sign up for our next session, which will be focused on building and sustaining mutual aid groups. The one after that is legal, financial, and security basics. There was also a number of questions in the Q&A that were asking around security specifically, so we'll be going into that. And then the final session is mutual aid in action, which will be a series of short presentations from Metro Atlanta Mutual Aid Fund, Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, Mutual Aid Eastie, Vicky Osterweil, who was Dean mentioned earlier in defense of looting, and the Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund. And so we'll be having short presentations from them and then breakouts to go deeper into all those different topics that they're covering. I want to make sure that, again, to encourage people to sign up for Canvas and to keep this conversation going. The chat was so alive here. For security reasons, we said at the beginning we would not be sharing the chat. We will be going through and grabbing links from the chat and posting them into Canvas. And we encourage people to continue the conversation, answer questions that other people are asking, take the first leap and ask questions. That's how we get conversations going. We have to be vulnerable in those spaces, in the spaces where it's safe to be so. Also, we have two bonus sessions that have been added on. We'll be doing an office hour, which will be open on this exact same time on Wednesday, March 19th. And then we'll be running an offers and needs market to be able to connect everybody, to be share resources back and forth, and you'll be able to see what that process looks like. Also, if you want to go deeper into mutual aid and disaster response, I encourage you to check out the Response podcast, which we produce at Shareable, and to check in on Shareable also. We've been around for about 15 years. We've published over 4,500 stories about the ways that people are sharing resources around the world, several how-to guides related to mutual aid. We collaborate with organizers and allies to imagine, resource, network, and scale cooperative projects. We envision a just, connected, and joyful world where sharing is daily practice and communities flourish. So invite you to go deeper into those resources at shareable.net. And hopefully we will see almost all of you, if not all of you, at this exact same time next week. Once again, thank you so much, Dean, for coming and sharing that amazing knowledge. And we will share this out with the world after the event is over.